Hello, welcome back to 123 Java. Today we're going to be doing another very elementary Java tutorial about variables and types. And these ideas that I'm going to be talking about are pretty widespread, I would say, across all languages in computer programming, so should be helpful in that regard. So let's start by talking about types. Types essentially are a way to distinguish the different kinds of information you can deal with in a program. And that might sound complicated right now, but it won't in a second. So you're going to have different kinds of data that you're dealing with. You might have a word, you might have a number, you might have a Boolean, which I'll get to, and all those different things are different in the way that they have different types. So here I'm going to talk about I would say the most widely used types in Java, and probably the ones you're going to see when you're first starting out. There are many more, but I'll start with these. So let's talk about a string for a second. A string is essentially any series of characters. So that can be a word, it can be a full paragraph, it can be a bunch of numbers, it can be your name, it can be pretty much anything that you can type on your keyboard. So if you want to, when you're dealing with these things, you start by declaring your variable. And to do that, you need to start out by mentioning its type, because the computer needs to know what kind of information you're dealing with when you start out. So if I want to create a string variable, the first thing I do is I put in its type, string. And you'll notice out of at least these four types, string is actually the only one that has a capital letter in its declaration, and that has to do with the fact that string is actually an object in Java and not a primitive type. That's a little more complicated, and so don't worry if you don't know what that means. But just remember when you're declaring strings, it always has a capital letter. So we have this type. Now, since this is a variable, we need to give it a name so that we know how to access it later. Everything needs a name, or else everything would just be all over the place. So let's call this string word, because we're going to put a word in it. So essentially what I've done here, just like this, is I've declared this variable. I'm telling the computer that there is a string and it's called word, and that exists. But what I haven't done yet is I haven't initialized it. I haven't given this variable a value. And I need to do that before I do anything to this variable. Now, to do that, we use this equals. Equals might seem a little confusing at first, because you've probably seen equals in mathematics, and the definition and usage of equals in computer science is very different. In math, when you see an equals sign, it means that is definite. When you see x equals 3, x is always equal to 3. Versus in programming, it almost means the opposite. It means that this variable has a value for now, but that value is completely mutable and can always change, can always be updated. So I like to think of variables as boxes. So I've created this box called word, and that has a string in it. Now I can put inside of this box some information, which is the string that we want to put in the box. Now when you're dealing with strings always go in these double quotation marks, or else your code won't compile. So you'll figure that out pretty quickly. So I'm going to put a string in here, and let's say hello. So there we have it. We've declared this variable, and we've also initialized it. We've given it that value. And we can do the exact same thing for these other types. We can say there's an int called integer. We can give it 5. So an integer is essentially should be pretty straightforward. Just like it is in math, any number that doesn't have any trailing decimal points, so whole numbers or integers. And you use those by saying int, and then we have doubles, which are the opposite. They are numbers that do have trailing decimal points. So let's call this double decimal. Okay, and then we have a Boolean. Booleans you probably have not heard of yet. They're very widely used in computer science, but a Boolean is simple in at least one regard, and that's that a Boolean can only have one of two values, true or false. It can never have both at the same time. It can only be one or the other. It can't be anything in between. So more on that later, but just know Booleans can only be true or false. So we created this Boolean, and let's say it's true. Equals true. Okay, so now we've given all these boxes their information. Now we can just prove that by printing out the contents of each of these boxes to the console, and you will see that in just a second. It's fairly straightforward. And the good thing about system.out.println is that it can print things that aren't something that isn't inherently a string or that wasn't declared as a string. It will process it in a way that allows it to still be printed to the console. So let's run this, and there it is, printed. So we know the contents of these boxes. Now, like we were saying, variables can always be updated. That's the point of a variable and why they are so useful. So I can go ahead and show you that. So we have this variable, this box called word. And because it's a variable, it can be changed. So let's do that. And the way you do that is you just need to make sure that, this is a common error when people first start out, you need to make sure that when you're updating this thing called word, that you don't redeclare it, and that would happen if you said string again. Because if you're saying string word equals blah blah blah, you're pretty much saying that there's another box, another variable called word, and it won't affect this one. Actually, I think this compiler might not even let me produce these two duplicate variables, because that can just lead to a whole mess. You never want that. So in order to not redeclare it, we just say its name, because it already exists from up here. Now we give it a new value. Let's say word is now goodbye. So now, if we tell the computer to print the contents of word, and we run this, it'll still print the old value because this command is happening before we updated it down here. But the very last command is telling it to print word, and it's only printing the most recent value that we've given it. It's printing goodbye, which means that this initial value is no longer relevant because we've switched it out of that box. And that's essentially the whole concept behind variables and why they're so useful. Now, this is pretty much the most elementary usage I could have shown you here, but variables are so crucial and so important to programming because in so many different cases you want to be able to have something that you then update the value of as you're going along. So that will come later, but for now this is very important, just so you understand how to declare and how to initialize your variables and understanding the very basics of these four basic Java types. So thank you for listening, and I hope this helped. Thank you.